So the entirety of the human body is a metabolic hybrid in that the body is largely burning fuel from two sources. It is burning blood glucose or sugar, blood sugar, or it's burning fat. Those are the two main fuels for the body by extension. Now, the brain was an exception. The brain is glucose or ketones, but I'll get to where the ketones come from. The rest of the body isn't really relying on ketones as much. It's fats or glucose or blood sugar. Insulin is what decides which fuel is used. So as much as the metabolic engine has two fuel sources, insulin will decide which one is opened and which one is closed. If insulin is high, the body is sugar burning. And you can measure this in the whole body level by measuring the amount of oxygen and CO2 that the body is producing, because different biochemistry or the burning of the fuels will produce a different amount of CO2.
So if I'm burning glucose, I might be producing more CO2.
Yes. Yeah. So we could hook you up to something called an indirect calorimeter and measure that your RER, the respiratory exchange ratio, the balance between CO2 and oxygen, would go higher. So we increase your insulin. Like if I infused you with insulin in the next few minutes, we would see that your RER would go up and we'd say, boy, you're sugar burning. Or we allow insulin to come down and then the RER goes down, which is reflective of fat burning. So it's insulin that determines whether the body is sugar burning or fat burning. Now, when insulin has been low for about 16 or so hours, something interesting starts happening at the liver. So the liver, with insulin being low, is burning a lot of fat, including its own fat that the liver can store. The liver can store fat, but also fat coming from fat cells. Because if insulin is low, the fat cells are just leaking out fat to be burned by the body. And because insulin is low, the liver keeps burning it. And the liver essentially continues to burn so much fat that it fills its own needs. It meets its own needs and says to itself, hey, I don't need to keep burning fat. I have all the energy I need. I'm doing great. But it can't stop burning fat because insulin is low. And if insulin stays low, fat burning keeps going. And so...
Because the body doesn't have enough glucose.
Well, it's acting... Yeah, so in this sense, it's doing it to help replace the glucose that isn't coming in. That's the value of the ketone. So as the liver is continuing to burn fat, it essentially gets to a point of fat burning where it's burning more fat than it needs. And that excess, if you will, is what becomes ketones. So ketones are kind of a metabolic release valve for the liver cell to say, I don't know what to do with all this fat burning. Okay, I know what I'm going to do. There's not a lot of glucose coming in. And so the brain may start to get hungry. So I'm going to start making ketones. And so ketones are nothing more than a product of a lot of fat burning. And anyone who even fasts for 24 hours, you wake up that next morning, you're in some degree of ketosis. Lest anyone think it's an extreme thing. People are going in and out of ketosis ideally often. Now, why do I say ideally? It's because ketones are, as we've already outlined, perhaps the best fuel for the brain. The brain thrives on ketones. You can take a person with early stage Alzheimer's disease and have them go through a series of cognitive tests, and they do horribly on them. Like one example is you ask the patient with Alzheimer's to draw the face of an analog clock, a circle with 1, 2 through 12, and then some hands on it. And it is utter chaos. This is published reports. You then put them into ketosis, ask them, can you please draw the face of a clock? It's still sloppy, but it is absolutely the face of a clock. You ask them when they're not in ketosis to try to tie their shoelaces. They can't think through the puzzle of tying the shoelaces. Ask them to do it again when they're in ketosis. All of a sudden, they can tie their shoelaces. More than that, they can get themselves dressed. All of these are published case reports. It's just my long-winded way of saying the brain thrives when it has ketones as a fuel source. But the benefits don't stop there. My lab published a report finding that when humans were in ketosis, which is just a term for ketones being elevated, we pulled out small pieces of belly fat and measured the metabolic rate of that belly fat. And we found that in ketosis, the metabolic rate of that belly fat was 3 times higher than when the people were not in ketosis.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so that means that the fat was suddenly behaving in a much more energetic way. That fat tissue has a very low metabolic rate. And then all of a sudden, when the ketones came into them, they started getting much more active and they started burning more energy. which is going to be very helpful for someone who wants to lose fat. If your fat cells now have a 3 times higher metabolic rate, that means that the fat cells are starting to act a little bit more like your muscle cells, and they're just burning more energy.
So does that mean that I'm going to lose fat faster? What does that mean?
Absolutely. And that is what happens. There are very well done controlled studies to show that if you control for all calories, when a human is in ketosis, their metabolic rate goes up. Your whole body is just burning more. It's just everything's kind of been turned on a little more. The furnace of the metabolism has just been, you have a little more fuel kind of stoking the fire. So ketones will increase metabolic rate of fat tissue. We found a paper that we published documenting how we took muscle cells and kind of insulted the muscle cells to determine how tough the muscle cells were. When we incubated the muscle cells with ketones, they were much more resistant to injury. So the ketones act to protect muscle tissue. And in a way, that is reflective of a function of ketones. Ketones are a defender of muscle. Ketones are basically the way to tell the brain, saying, brain, you think you need a lot of glucose, and if you don't get enough glucose, you would start stripping the protein from muscle to turn it into glucose. But I'm here as a ketone, so you can eat me instead and leave the muscle alone. So we published, again, a direct report finding that ketones actually make muscle more resistant to injury. And this could be why you're seeing more and more elite athletes using ketones as an actual ergogenic aid or like a supplement to help them be better. So at my university, at BYU, just this year, our men's and women's cross-country team took the national championships, the best college runners in the nation. Pretty impressive. One of the things they do is they take these ketone drinks before they train and before they race. Some more and more of the Tour de France teams take ketone supplements because it is just another fuel. It is something that the body can burn. That we always say, well, if once you start running out of glucose, you're going to bonk or you're going to hit the wall. Well, what if you don't really use glucose because you're burning a lot of fat and a lot of ketones instead, and that keeps your glucose kind of untouched, or you're not relying on the glucose. And we see this in humans. If there's a human that has adapted to a ketogenic diet, they burn fat at a higher rate than was ever thought humanly possible. That fat is basically fueling all of their muscle movement during the exercise session rather than relying predominantly on glucose. The body has adapted. It's burning fat for fuel, and when available, it's burning ketones for fuel, and it's leaving the muscle as sort of a last resort when it really needs a big kick.
I've seen these keto drinks.
Yes.
They're almost like little shots.
Well, there's a bunch of different types. If you look at the spectrum of ketones, on one end, you have the cheapest, most readily available, although less effective, called ketone salts, where it takes a molecule of ketone and binds it to a mineral like calcium or magnesium. Not as effective, and it's a lot of mineral, so people will find that they may get a lot of plaque on their teeth, maybe increased risk of kidney stones, so comes with some consequences. Then you have the ketone ester, which often comes in shots.
Yeah.
Then you have the bioidentical BHB, or the bioidentical ketone. One company, which is Original Ketone, they make it. Now, these ones are more effective. You take a little bit of these and you will get an increase in ketones. They're a little more expensive too. It would result, so you're drinking it in, you're immediately absorbing it from your gut.
Yeah.
So if you were not in ketosis, let's say you had, and I'm not encouraging people to do this, you had just eaten 2 bagels and a cup of sugary coffee. You're no ketones, undetectable, because insulin has come up, it's inhibited ketone production. And then you drink a shot of the ketone, within an hour, we would detect your ketones. They would have gone up maybe to 1 millimolar, which is a pretty significant bump.
Yeah.
And they're capable of that kind of movement. And maybe you do so because you're thinking, I really need to be sharp right now.
Would that make me sharper?
Well, that's where we have to speculate. There's no... my lab published animal evidence suggesting that, yes, indeed, it makes you sharper. That we had these animals navigate mazes and recognize objects. And when the animals were on a ketogenic diet, they were much sharper. They were much better at solving problems and remembering solutions to previous problems.
It's one of the, I asked this in particular because as my team know, because I've said it to them a lot over the last couple of weeks since I've been on the keto diet, and I've been literally pricking my finger to check
confirming
my keto levels. And the highest I've gotten to is like 2.5.
Which is high.
Is it high?
That's not problematic.
Right.
I mean, that is just proof positive that you're in ketosis, which itself is proof positive that you're burning a lot of fat and 3, that your insulin levels are low.
Fat dropped off my body like I've never seen in my life.
Exactly. The power of, so if someone is listening to this and they're thinking, okay, I need to shrink my fat cells.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they don't realize that there's 2 variables to what caused their fat cells to grow in the first place. They have no awareness of the value of insulin in this formula. All they do is pay attention to the calories. And so the average individual is looking down the road of this fat cell shrinking journey, and they're thinking, okay, what I have to do is just cut my calories. And what do they do to cut their calories? They do the exact wrong thing. And before I even answer that, let me just present the scenario. Let's imagine that Stephen and I, everyone listening is invited. Stephen and I are hosting a buffet. We have the world's best chefs. It is going to be a table filled with the most delicious foods you can imagine. You're in our invitation. We say, come hungry, because you're going to want to try a little bit of everything. Everyone listening, ask yourselves, what would you do to come as hungry as possible? You'd probably do 2 things. Or think, how did you go to your Thanksgiving or your Christmas dinner as hungry as possible? You would eat a little less in some period of time before the event, and you would exercise a little more. And it would work. You would be very hungry. That's why the traditional advice given for weight loss doesn't work, because we tell people, eat less, exercise more. Sure, you maybe lose a little bit of weight in the short term, but all that does, you've given them the perfect recipe to promote hunger. And hunger always wins. As a good example, in the US, we have a game show. Maybe there was some version of this in the UK called The Biggest Loser. It was essentially who can lose the most weight. And it was through a punishing regimen of caloric restriction. Eat less, exercise more. That is like the perfect embodiment of that approach. They were starving and they were exercising to insane degrees. And oh my goodness, did they lose a lot of weight. And yet you never see them again. They don't do a reunion tour 5 years or 10 years later because they gain it all back.
Do you know they gain it all back?
They do. In fact, a paper published in the US from the National Institutes of Health documented not only the degree to which they gain weight back, but also how it almost literally breaks their metabolism. That normally a person's metabolic rate is connected to their body mass. A bigger body has a higher metabolic rate. A smaller body has a lower metabolic rate. This is just human physiology. And no surprise, when someone loses weight, there's less of body, and so metabolic rate goes down. As they gain weight back, metabolic rate will typically go back up as well, except for the contestants in The Biggest Loser. They started with a high metabolic rate because of a high body fat level. They lost a substantial amount of weight. No surprise, metabolic rate went down substantially. But this is such a dramatic change that as they started gaining weight back, metabolic rate did not come back with it. It stayed lower than it should have. Normally, it's connected, sort of 1-to-1. Wherever body weight is going, metabolic rate is going, except in these people. That method of dramatic weight loss through such severe restriction, which is based purely on the caloric theory of obesity, leads to significant hunger. So no surprise, if a person's attempting to shrink their fat cells or lose weight, if the first step is, I'm going to cut my calories, and they don't address their high insulin, they're never going to lose weight in the long run. They're going to step right back to where they were. Because if they start cutting calories, but insulin is still high, that's going to make them very hungry because insulin wants to be storing energy. A professor from Harvard named David Ludwig found this. If you have people eating a lower calorie meal that spikes their insulin, it makes them much hungrier than a lower calorie meal that doesn't spike insulin. So that's the key. Anyone listening, if you're thinking, I need to be on a fat cell shrinking journey, let the first step of that journey be, I'm going to lower my insulin. Which means I'm going to control my carbohydrates. I'm going to stop eating carbohydrates that come from bags and boxes with barcodes. And while I am restricting those carbohydrates, I'm going to focus more on protein and fat. So control carbs, prioritize protein, and don't fear the fat that comes with those proteins. Fat and protein together is a miraculous combination of helping you feel full, and it is literally giving everything you need. There are such things as essential proteins. There are such things as essential fats, so focus on those. And that will be the key to helping insulin come down. Then, as you have found, and when you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat. But what the person will find is they're lowering their insulin, all while their metabolic rate is going up. They're learning how to burn their own fat for fuel because remember the metabolic hybrid, that metaphor, that if you want to lose fat, you need to burn fat. You're not going to lose fat if you're always burning glucose. It's fat that you need to burn. And as you start burning more fat, you realize that it's like the hump on a camel. That hump exists because it is a big source of fat for that animal to be using its own fat for energy. We have our own version of that. So you think about the average individual who's chubby, they have hundreds of thousands of calories waiting to be burned in those fat cells. It's just that their chronically elevated insulin is never letting them burn it. And so as the person starts making these changes in their diet to lower insulin, they now can finally start relying on their own fat for fuel. So it's no surprise that their hunger starts to come down. Let that be the natural way in which you're controlling your calories. Don't control your calories because you're forcing yourself to be hungry and eat less. Control your calories because you simply aren't hungry. I'm an advocate of a ketogenic diet, although it can be applied differently across different people. But I would say anyone would benefit from having some modest period of time of elevated ketones, at least in some portion of the day. Now, how do you maintain muscle mass in the midst of such obvious weight loss? I can only speculate. Now, there are peer-reviewed studies that I can cite which do support the idea that a human can be on a ketogenic diet and have a total maintenance of muscle and strength. That is published. So we know it's possible, although that doesn't seem to be what happened with you. I would suspect that there were two things happening, possibly. One could have been that you had relatively lower energy during your workouts because of a slight degree of dehydration. And then the other one would be calories, which I'll come back to in a moment. I just wanted to put it out there. So when insulin comes down, one of the many effects in the body is that another hormone comes down called aldosterone, which is one we've never invoked yet. But low insulin leads to lower aldosterone. When aldosterone comes down, the kidneys begin to eliminate salt and water much more rapidly. Now that's not problematic, but it does mean that a person does have to focus more on hydration and salts. So if someone's going on this strategy and they exercise fairly often, you need to be much more focused on your hydration, literally drinking more because you will be urinating more, which is partly why people's blood pressure gets so good so quickly. And just to pause on that point, if someone is on 1 or 2 blood pressure medications and they adopt a ketogenic diet, they usually have to stop their medications within 2 days because their blood pressure goes to normal so quickly that if they stay on the medication, they're going too low. So one could be that you were actually working out a little less intensely because of the dehydration. But then 2, it's possible that you were eating too few calories to actually maintain muscle. Muscle is a hungry organ. It is metabolically expensive for the body to keep that muscle on. And as you start to get leaner and leaner, it gets harder and harder for the body to defend that muscle. In fact, that's the difference between fasting and starvation. The longest known evidence of a fast was a man in the UK who fasted for 384 days, literally not eating or drinking a single calorie. He was under medical supervision, getting vitamins and minerals and water, and he went on to live a perfectly healthy life. But what was the difference? Why was that not starvation? Starvation is when you run out of fat. So you might have gotten to the point of so lean that you didn't have enough fat to burn to make enough ketones to fuel the brain. If you don't have enough fat to burn to make enough ketones, and the brain is saying, all right, well, I wanted to switch to ketones so that I could spare the glucose, but I can't. There's not enough ketones here, so I have to rely 100% on glucose. But if you're not eating glucose, now the body has to start stripping the protein from muscle. And it sends those amino acids to the liver. Then the liver is so capable, it will turn those amino acids into glucose.
So it turns my muscle
into glucose to feed the brain. So my comment then, finally getting to my answer is, in your version of a ketogenic diet, with your level of muscle mass and your inherent metabolic rate based on your body size and your activity, you probably ought to eat more fat.
I wasn't actually doing the blood test at that point. Mm-hmm. I'm doing it this time around, but I wasn't doing the blood test, so I can actually see my keto levels.
Yeah.
So maybe I wasn't even in ketosis because I wasn't having enough fats.
You might have been, but it could have been that you were simply not eating enough calories.
Okay.
I have to. So this is an instance where
that's what I'm trying to do this time. I'm trying to
eat more fat.
Yeah.
Like every time you're making a steak, put butter on there. And when you're drinking a cup of coffee, as crazy as it sounds, I drink yerba mate every morning. I will put a big dab of butter, like a big dab of butter in my tea, and I'm sipping on it while the world's still asleep and the kids haven't woken up yet. And so I know, because I want to keep my muscle. As a guy who's almost 50, I find that during my strict ketogenic phase, and I'm currently in it as well, every January I go to kind of a carnivore diet. And I mostly do it to, one, lean down, but also to check any addictions and habits. I don't like feeling addicted to things. And my wife will comment. And even as an almost 50-year-old, it's fun to see my six-pack coming. I don't want to lose my mass, my muscle mass, because you have to work so hard to get it.
Yeah.
And what I find is if I increase my fat, I always get plenty of protein. In fact, I didn't even finish, because I distracted myself, mentioning some of the benefits of ketones. But ketones are further anti-inflammatory. Like, they directly reduce inflammation in the body by inhibiting inflammatory processes. And they also improve antioxidant defenses, so it helps reduce oxidative stress. So ketones do have benefits that go beyond even what we've taken the time to articulate. If there's any negative to a ketogenic diet, it could be that you acutely or you temporarily become less metabolically flexible. Now, that's me invoking a term we haven't brought up yet. But metabolic flexibility is a term to refer to the body's ability to, when it eats glucose, to burn glucose. When it's not eating glucose, it burns fat. So you're shifting between the two metabolic fuels that we outlined earlier. When someone has been adhering to a ketogenic diet for some time, it's almost as if their body is stuck in fat-burning mode. And that if you and I, being in such adapted ketogenic state as we are, if we were to go to lunch and eat 2 bagels and a sugary drink, it would take us a very long time to clear that glucose from our blood. Much longer than otherwise. Like, let's say we go out with the production team, they're eating a normal higher carb diet. All things equal, same body size, same activity, their glucose levels would come up and down in 90 minutes, perhaps. Yours and mine may take 180 minutes to come back down. So the person may say, well, gosh, Stephen and Ben are no longer burning glucose very well. And that's true. In that one moment, our bodies had almost forgotten what it was like to burn a bunch of glucose because we had adapted to fat burning.
So what about the gut microbiome?
Oh, yeah.
Because I told someone who is a nutritionist that I was doing a keto diet at the moment, and they said, oh, your poor gut.
Ah, yes. Well, what a naive thing to say, if I may gently reprimand your friend. There's no evidence to support that there's any harmful change in the microbiome. In fact, a paper was just published that looked at a man who went from a normal omnivorous human diet with abundant plant matter to a purely carnivorous diet, literally 0 carb, and they documented precisely no change in his microbiome, none whatsoever.
But is he eating plants?
No. Well, he had been eating plants. So the case study was a person eating a normal diet of plants and meat, a normal omnivore diet, and then looked at the microbiome and then adapted to a purely carnivorous diet, purely meat. And the microbiome didn't change at all.
What's the time period?
Months, I think. The problem with the microbiome, the reason I don't take microbiome research too seriously as a scientist is that it is a big black box. You came from the UK to London, to LA, to California. If we took a microbiome sample analysis of your time in the UK now, it would be different now. Even though you're eating the same, but you're drinking different water, you're breathing different air. I was just on a plane from Utah to California. Give me a day or so, I would have some sort of shift in my microbiome. So the microbiome can change in response to all kinds of things. The idea that you somehow have decimated your microbiome because you aren't eating fiber is absolutely false. That is completely false. Now, there might be a change in some of the population of your microbiome, more of one, less of another, but there's no evidence to suggest that's problematic. Your microbiome is intact. Those bacteria do not die. They're just simply metabolizing other things. Maybe they're relying more on short-chain fatty acids. Maybe they're relying more on amino acids. They're not eating fiber, but there's still stuff in the meat or the eggs that the microbiome will eat.
But if eating lots of plants does give me a more diverse gut microbiome, then if I stop eating plants, I'm going to have a less diverse gut microbiome.
Yeah, but Stephen, but even then there's a bit of an assumption built into the question, because it's, do we know that the microbiome will be less diverse? The case study I just mentioned found that in this one single man, it didn't change his microbiome at all. It was the exact same populations in all the same proportions.
Because aren't the plants like feeding the bacteria?
Yeah. So the fiber is. So fiber will, but again, that's not the only thing bacteria can eat. Bacteria can eat fats. Bacteria can eat amino acids. They can eat glutamine, for example. They can, even meat will have a little bit of glucose in it, where the muscle has something called glycogen. And so there's, trace amounts of glucose in even the meat that you're eating. So I do not look at the argument that, you're destroying your microbiome. That has no scientific support. You may be changing your microbiome, but who's to say that's a bad change? Maybe it's a better change. You certainly are feeling better. You're thinking better. You're getting leaner. Your insulin sensitivity's improved. Cognition's improved. I would argue if there is a change in your microbiome, it's probably one that's for the best. And no one can prove that wrong. As much as I just stated that comment in a speculative fashion, it's speculative because there's no evidence. This is why I look at the microbiome and just say, yeah, it appears to matter, but in ways that we don't know.
But you agree with the argument that if I sat here now and I ate a wide range of plants for the next, let's say, 6 months, when you analyzed my gut microbiome, it would be much more diverse?
I'm not agreeing to that.
Really?
I don't know if that's true. And again, I would cite that one case report I just mentioned now, which is a man who did this. They reported that the microbiome was identical, that there was no significant change.
That's just one man, though?
It was one man. It was a case report, which is not a randomized clinical study. So, but even still, with my speculation heavily handed here, I would say probably more plants would result in a more diverse microbiome. But I would say, but then the next step is a harder one, which is that good or bad? I don't know. Maybe all you're doing is promoting the growth of bacteria that make more gas because they're fermenting the fiber and you just have more flatulence as a result of it. Dietitians will say, well, a diverse microbiome is a good microbiome. Well, prove it. How do we know that? How can you prove that to me? As a basic scientist, I want to see the hard evidence, because what I can prove is that we can take humans who are overweight and diabetic and hypertensive, eating a standard American or global diet, and put them onto a ketogenic diet, which is going to be a much simpler diet, and yet every clinical marker gets better. And so if someone were to say, yeah, but sure, you've reversed your diabetes and your hypertension, but your poor microbiome, I would say, well, I don't care about my microbiome. I care about the human. And so if there's less diversity, but every single clinical marker has gotten better, perhaps more diversity is not what we want in our bacteria. I'm speculating, but so is the person who states that. A person would benefit from some state of ketosis on a frequent basis, if for no other reason than to really give the brain a heavy dose of just straight energy. Not that everyone needs to be as strict as perhaps you and I are being at the moment, but I would say the more a person has a disorder or a disease that benefits from ketosis, the more then they ought to focus on it. Like if someone has type 2 diabetes, if they adopt a ketogenic diet, they will be off all of their diabetes medications in months, all of them. If someone has epilepsy, or migraine headaches, from 1913, I think was the first published report on this. If there's someone who suffers from migraines, as long as they're in ketosis, they may never have another migraine again. I mean, it is completely curative or preventative for the disorder. Same with epilepsy, that many forms of epilepsy. So depending on the person, they would benefit from being in ketosis forever. For everyone else who's just sort of a normal individual who wants to be lean and keep their brain healthy and happy, etc., I would say it's generally prudent to just control your carbs, be mindful of the type of carbohydrate you're eating. And as I said earlier, just try to focus on the carbs that don't come from bags and boxes with barcodes. I'm actually quite liberal in my view when it comes to whole fruits and vegetables. I'd say eat them, enjoy them liberally, but then also make sure you're getting some good protein and fat, because there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. That sounds controversial, but humans we have no requirement for carbohydrate. We do have requirement for fat and protein. There is such a breadth of diversity when it comes to sweeteners, from artificial to natural to another rare sugar, more and more. There's all these not random, but a very broad spectrum of molecules that we have developed or found that taste like sugar but don't have the effect of sugar. So on the good end are things like that have been shown to have no insulin effect. And so, I appreciate everyone listening, letting me kind of stay with that as my framework, because people are going to go on and criticize all kinds of other things about other sweeteners, and that's just too broad. That's a topic for a whole book. With regards to just insulin, on the good end, where they have no effect, it would be one as common as aspartame. So like diet drinks, not the zero drinks, but the diet drinks will have aspartame as the sweetener.
Is it a difference?
There is a difference. And I'll get to that other one in a moment.
So I should be having diet instead of zero?
Well, I personally go to diet rather than zero. But that's because aspartame is the sole sweetener in the diet rather. And it has no effect on insulin. So too, erythritol. Erythritol is a little right around aspartame. Is generally a good one. But monk fruit extract, stevia, and especially allulose, those are inert when it comes to insulin. Allulose, stevia, monk fruit extract, aspartame, no effect. Erythritol, no effect. But erythritol, that ending OL, is reflective of a class of sweetener called a sugar alcohol. And that does not mean it's alcoholic. That just refers to the actual chemical structure that puts it in the alcohol family. Once you get into the sugar alcohols, you start to get a little problematic, where erythritol is a good one, and xylitol is generally a good one, but then you get to things like maltitol and mannitol, and they do have an insulin effect.
And what kind of foods have those?
Yeah, so often like you can get mannitol in like artificially sweetened chocolate sometimes, for reasons that I don't know. I don't know why the food formulator puts them in some things and not other things. The problem, I chuckle because it becomes so apparent with some of those artificial sweeteners, like the sugar alcohols, is that as you eat them, you taste it sweet in your mouth, and it doesn't have any caloric value in the body because it stays in the intestines. And this is something that is largely unique to the sugar alcohols. Whereas it stays in the intestines, it starts pulling in water from the body, which starts to create a fairly inconvenient degree of flatulence and diarrhea. And so a person will know if they've eaten too many of those types of sweeteners because their intestines will tell them so. So, but also on that spectrum, kind of in the middle, is the one that's in the zero drinks, which is one called sucralose. And while sucralose is generally not a problem with insulin, it is a sweetener that has been shown to cross the blood-brain barrier. And so the reason I avoid the zero drinks and go to the diet drinks is that aspartame does no such thing. Aspartame just gets divided into amino acids. We just digest it and absorb amino acids. Sucralose can cross the blood-brain barrier, and I don't know what it's doing there, but I don't want it there. And so I avoid the zero drinks because I don't want that sweetener. But personally, when I'm adhering to this diet, diet soda is my actual indulgence, where I want something sweet, and yet I don't want the metabolic effect of it. Salt has earned a terrible reputation because of a series of studies that implicated salt consumption as a cause of high blood pressure. And really briefly, as a momentary physiology professor, that is a real effect. If you and I were to go eat salt, our body for the next several hours afterwards would retain its water in order to balance out the salt so that we didn't get too salty. So we would retain water in order to keep our salt at a normal level. And so that could be reflected by an elevated blood pressure. However, multiple huge studies have found that if you go to a population of humans that have high blood pressure and you tell them you need to cut your salt in order to correct your blood pressure, they may at most move their blood pressure by 1 or 2 points. It has an absolutely negligible, irrelevant effect. And it's because salt is not a key contributor to blood pressure. It's actually insulin resistance. Insulin resistance will force the body to hold on to salt. Insulin resistance will force the blood vessels to be very constricted. all of which play together to make for a very high blood pressure. So as much as we have been telling the world that we should be cutting back salt, no, we should have been telling them to cut back on what spikes your insulin, refined starches and sugars. But with regards to salt, it's interesting for me to note, where did that whole view come from? Within the United States, decades ago, there was a study that was published, and they called it the DASH diet. Dietary approaches to stop hypertension, DASH, the DASH diet. And in the DASH diet, one of the critical changes was to tell people to eat less salt. And when they found that when people adopt a DASH diet, it's amazing, their blood pressure goes down. However, unfortunately, they also tell people to do lots of other things with the DASH diet. Like when they tell someone to go on the DASH diet, they also tell them to eat less sugar and less refined starches and sugars. Well, it's possible, indeed, I would say it's absolutely the case, that what's actually lowering their blood pressure isn't that they cut their salt back, it's that they were cutting their refined starches and sugars back. And it's that that had the main effect. And the cutting the salt was just some innocent bystander. But to put a fine point on it, in human studies, if you have humans cut back their salt considerably, they become insulin resistant. So take a healthy group of humans, say you need to eat less salt, and they do so. If you measure them a week later while they're adhering to this, they will be significantly more insulin resistant than before they ever cut back their salt. It's one of the ironies of the whole scenario where a physician may be telling a patient with high blood pressure, you need to cut back your salt. And they end up eating less salt, and yet their blood pressure gets worse. It's because the main contributor to high blood pressure is insulin resistance. And by telling them to cut back on their salt, you made them more insulin resistant. And that whole mechanism is because one of insulin's many, many effects is to want the body to hold on to salt and water. And so if you start cutting your salt, all of a sudden insulin says, well, there's little salt coming in. I need to do what I can to retain whatever salt we do have. And so it starts retaining salt and water more in order to try to offset the lack of salt coming in. And while insulin's going higher and higher, the body's becoming more and more insulin resistant. So salt restriction can cause insulin resistance in humans. There are 4 pillars. So the first one, control carbohydrates. Second, prioritize protein. Third, don't fear fat. And then fourth, after the first 3 have been taken care of, 4, frequently fast. That the more you're opening up a package and getting your chips or your crackers or your cereal or your bread, the more you're going to be spiking your glucose and your insulin. Keep that on the shelves at the grocery store. Focus on whole fruits and vegetables. That's going to be the key for, number 1, control carbs. Now, while you're eating fewer carbohydrates, you need to eat something. And so prioritize protein. I would say particularly animal source protein, which is the best source of all of the amino acids that humans need. And then with those proteins will come fat. Don't fear that fat. That's number 3. Fat is very satiating when combined with protein. When fat and protein come together, we digest it better. Sometimes people will find that if they just have a scoop of whey protein, it can be very upsetting on their stomach. It's because we're not supposed to eat protein alone. In nature, that never happens. In nature, protein always comes with fat. That's how we should eat it. We digest it better. And human studies have shown that when a human eats pure protein, there's some degree of muscle growth, albeit microscopically, minuscule. But when we eat protein with fat, we have significantly greater muscle growth than we do with the protein alone. So that is the 3 pillars that encompass the macronutrients, or the big parts of our diet. But once a person has done that, then they are well positioned to adopt a strategy, a structured strategy of fasting. And that can be, there are as many ways to fast as there are people who want to do it. There's no right way or wrong way. My goal by invoking that 4th principle, and I do think it should come last, once you've learned how to eat better food, your body has adapted to burning its own fat for fuel. But it can take intermittent fasting where it's 1 meal of the day you're fasting through. It can do where people do alternate day fasting. There are countless different ways to do it.
Even if I'm in ketosis?
Then you don't need to do it as much because you're already lowering your insulin. So if a person's already in ketosis, in fact, if a person were in ketosis and frequently fasting, depending on how lean they are, it's going to become extremely difficult to retain muscle.
Yeah.
So those are the 4 pillars. It will be an extraordinarily effective way to address insulin resistance. But the problem, as I started that I mentioned, is that while these concepts are simple, that does not mean they're easy, because humans show addictive tendencies to only one macronutrient, not fats, not proteins. All of the evidence of the neurobiology of addiction in humans points to carbohydrates. And so as much as I lay out this simple plan, it can be difficult. And this is why this self-discipline required is difficult enough that it's why people find that they have to result in, relying on drugs for these kinds of things. The best exercise to improve insulin sensitivity is the one you'll do. And so if someone listening to this is an 80-year-old grandma, if her form of exercise is walking around the street, down around the block with her girlfriends, but then if someone else has the ability to go cross-country skiing or CrossFit, do it. So the best exercise is the one you'll do. Now, having said that, the better exercise is the one that you'll do that keeps muscle. Muscle building work is going to be minute for minute a more effective way of improving insulin sensitivity than any kind of aerobic activity. And that's because muscle is the great consumer of glucose. In fact, not only does muscle eat the most glucose from the blood, but it's also how it eats the glucose when it's exercising. So earlier, we talked about how insulin kind of comes and knocks on the door of the muscle cell. And then the muscle cell will open the door and allow the glucose to come in, thereby lowering blood glucose, unless the muscle is exercising. When a muscle is exercising, and I'm kind of mimicking the contraction and relaxation of a muscle, when the muscle is exercising, it has its own way of opening those doors. So there's an insulin-independent method where the muscle cell essentially tells insulin, I know normally I have to wait for you to come and open these doors, but I'm so hungry during this exercise that I'm not going to wait. And so the doors just open. So the contracting muscle has its own way to rush to pull the glucose in, which means, of course, that a person's going to have an easier time controlling their blood glucose, which in turn would mean a better time controlling insulin. But the more muscle a person has, the easier it is. And this could be one of the reasons why, if you look at longevity and look at the markers of muscle strength versus the markers of cardiovascular aerobic fitness, the aerobic fitness markers are terrible predictors of longevity. It's muscle and strength that predicts longevity for multiple reasons, including just the very act of living and moving, but also because if you have more muscle, you're going to control your glucose better, which means you're going to control your insulin better. Then you're back to these variables that people use to predict, or what are the most accurate indicators of longevity? It's who has the best glucose control. More muscle helps that happen. Carbohydrates are not essential. This is controversial. People don't like to acknowledge it, but there is literally no biological need that humans have for carbohydrate. In the United States, a report decades ago from the Department of Agriculture looking at the needs of human nutrition, there's a quote there, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but I'll get it pretty close. It stated in this document that the lower limit of carbohydrate consumption in humans is 0. In other words, there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Now, I'm not saying, well, then let's not eat any of them. No, but I am saying, why is that the one we focus the most on, as 70% of all calories globally are coming from that one? You're telling me that most of what we eat comes from what we don't need? Why not put the focus on the things we do need? There are such things as essential fatty acids. Let's eat fat. There are such things as essential amino acids. So let's eat protein and make sure we get what we need. And then on any remainder of the plate, we can get some other things that we want to nibble on, like plants. I have kept my finger on the pulse of the whole field of gut-derived hormones, which is what we talk about with these weight loss drugs, almost since their beginning. My dissertation work was in a lab, one of the first funded labs to look at these drugs, although in the context of diabetes. And then it's blossomed into the context in the use of obesity. This is the class of drug, GLP-1 receptor agonist. First of all, what is GLP-1? GLP-1 is a hormone that we all make from our guts. Our small intestine will make GLP-1. We're making it all the time to varying degrees. Some things we eat will result in a higher GLP-1. Sometimes it'll be a lower GLP-1. Like, for example, a paper just published a few months ago found that if you have people eat the exact same meal of calories, but lower carb or higher carb, the lower carb version of the meal will increase GLP-1 3 times higher in the blood than the high carb version of the meal.
Which means that they'll feel...
Yeah, so then what's the point? Who cares about GLP-1? One of GLP-1's main effects is to tell the brain that we're full.
Okay, so more GLP-1,
more satiety. Yeah, more GLP-1, less hunger, which is very impactful. In fact, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a study that was published in Humans a while ago. They took obese humans and lean humans and had them eat fat and found that, like pure fat, and they found that the GLP-1 response was the same. Whether you were lean or obese, you had the same amount of GLP-1. That would suggest that whether you're lean or obese, both of your brains in both of these populations will have the fat and have the same sense of, I'm full. Because it was matched with GLP-1. However, when they had these same groups eat pure carbohydrate, the lean group had a robust GLP-1 response, big GLP-1. In other words, they would eat the carbohydrate and say, I'm full, because GLP-1 would tell them so. However, in the obese group, they ate that exact same amount of carbohydrate and they had an almost negligible GLP-1 effect.
They were still hungry.
In other words, they would eat the same amount of carbohydrate as their lean counterpart and then just say, okay, what's next? I'm still hungry. And so it is prudent to focus on GLP-1. GLP-1 is a powerful hormone that does have an effect on human health. What I feel inclined to comment on is the negative side effects, because the only thing we hear about is social media influencers extolling the benefits. And hey, I'm on this weight loss drug and I've lost 50 pounds. Someone has to be the voice that says, yeah, but what about this? And there are some significant but whatabouts when it comes to these weight loss drugs. One of them is the loss of muscle mass or lean mass. You've mentioned a couple papers from the New England Journal of Medicine, a paper a couple years ago from what was called the Step 5 trials looking at these drugs. They found that for every 6 pounds of fat a person was losing on these drugs, they were losing 4 pounds of fat-free mass or lean mass. So 40% of the weight they were losing on these drugs is coming from lean mass, like including muscle and bone. So there are now case reports of young, healthy women who were overweight, who go on the drug for some period of time, and after they get diagnosed with osteoporosis, where they have eroded their bone health. They're losing lean mass. So again,
they've eroded their bone health.
Yeah, so 40% of the weight that people are losing on these drugs appears to, at these high doses, is coming from lean mass. So fat-free mass, including muscle and bone. The reason I find that so troubling is that in the UK, at 2 years on the drug, 69% of people get off the drug. They don't want to be on it anymore. And now imagine this individual. Imagine, if you will, a 60-year-old woman who's been on the drug. I take that age and that sex on purpose because it's so hard for her to grow new muscle and bone. Let's say she's been on this drug for a year and she's lost 20 kilos. Well, 40% of that will have come from her lean mass, and 60% of it came from her fat. And then when she gets off the drug, now all of a sudden, her lean mass, her muscle and bone, that's never coming back. The muscle and bone that she has lost is gone forever, probably at that age, because we can't, after the age of 60, good luck developing new muscle and bone. But what can come back rapidly is the fat mass. And so at 2 years, she decides to get off the drug, which again, about 70% of people do. They're going to gain that fat back, but they're not going to gain their muscle and bone back. That is a significant loss that may be, depending on their age, gone forever.
And I'm going to play this video to you. It's from a singer called Avery, and she talks about her experience with Ozempic.
I just left the doctor's office. I went to get a checkup because I've been off of Ozempic for 2 months now, and I just wanted to see if my body was in better condition, if there were any permanent damages. Kind of in shock right now because I wasn't expecting this, but I guess Ozempic can cause bone density loss, and I didn't think that that would happen to me because I was only on it for a year, but I have significant bone loss. I have osteoporosis and osteopenia, so I don't know, there's like several of them that I have. I wasn't expecting that, but that's what happens if you use Ozempic for weight loss and you lose too much weight.
Yeah, I wonder, she's so lean, I wouldn't be surprised if she had it even worse than normal, because we see it has become, I don't mean to suggest this is the case for her, but you do see people using these weight loss drugs who are already very lean.
I mean, I've got a picture of her here, and she does look incredibly lean already.
But see, this is what people are doing. They're basically using it to facilitate an eating disorder in the people who are lean. This has become so common that there are complaints saying that, you know, lean, healthy people are getting the prescription and people who are obese and diabetic aren't because of shortages. The leaner, I've seen this. I know someone personally who was already a perfectly lean, healthy woman, and then she now looks sickly. And what caused it? Well, she wasn't lean enough. And when you take enough of that drug that you just have no more hunger because of how it's acting at your brain, you do just stop eating. And the malnutrition, at least in part, is going to cause a loss of lean mass. But that also it is even further exacerbated by the mental health problems, where there was a paper recently published with the use of these drugs, finding that people, when they begin the drug, their risk of suicidal thoughts doubles. It goes up by over 100%. And their risk of major depression triples. And this, so as much as we talk about these drugs and we say the drug helps you control your cravings, what it's doing is perhaps reducing your craving for everything. That while you are eating less food, which is resulting in the weight loss, you also are not interested as much in exercise as you used to be, which is going to make it even easier for you to lose your muscle and bone. You're also less interested in hobbies like going to play pickleball with your friends or going out and drinking with the boys. So there is this kind of, what's reflected across all of their interests is that their cravings for everything starts to...
Girl mentioned that, Avery. I've just seen she's uploaded a post that says, "Thanks, my record label told me I was fat. They dropped me. I got addicted to Ozempic.
Oh my gosh.
I got addicted to Ozempic, and now as a result, I have osteoporosis and my bones are as fragile as wafer cookies."
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. So now that...
Obviously, you know, these are claims that she's alleging. Now we don't know the full picture of her health, and there might be something more.
Yeah, but we do know, based on the one report, that 40% of weight loss is coming from fat-free mass. And so it is in people's best interest to be mindful of that tendency, and that if they're going to explore the use of the drug, to do so responsibly. And I want to mention that kind of caveat or angle to everything, because I don't want someone listening to me thinking, all right, Ben says I should never touch this and it is uniformly evil and bad. I'm not saying that. I find that I have to speak a little more boldly about the negative consequences because nobody talks about them. What would she have done if she knew about them, for example? No one knows about these kinds of negatives because people want to sweep them under the rug. Now, I believe there is a use case for these drugs, although different from how it's being used currently. In my mind, the best use of these drugs is to help someone learn how to control their carbohydrate addiction, because it will help you control your addiction. Sweet cravings goes down significantly within 6 months of the person taking the drug. So I think, in addition to getting proper education, and if I may be so bold, I would say it's those pillars I mentioned earlier: control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. All the more reason, prioritize protein and fat to help preserve your muscle and bone. Muscle and bone are not made of carbohydrate. They're made of protein and fat. Eat protein and fat. Lift weights to keep any of that lean mass you can. Keep the integrity of your bones intact. But take advantage of the drug helping reduce your cravings for sweet things especially. I would say find the lowest effective dose you can, where you are able, with a little bit of self-discipline, where you're not assigning all of the self-discipline to the syringe that you're going to inject into your tummy. There is value in learning to deny yourself something you know you shouldn't be doing. There's life lessons to learn there. And so enough of the drug that makes it a little easier for you to overcome your carbohydrate addiction. At the same time, you're learning how to eat well. You're learning how to eat properly by managing your macronutrients and lifting weights. And then over time, ideally, I would say, you find that you are able to reduce the dose of the drug and then eventually get off of it entirely.